Hello everyone, and welcome to another Anime Villainous video. I, as always, am Chaos in the Sky, and as the title suggests, this video is going to give you a bunch of tips and pointers on how to get better at the competitive side of Anime Villainous. Throughout this video, we'll be covering what you should be looking to do and learn to do well in Aniville's competitive 1v1 scene. And I do mean we, because I'm not alone for this video. I'm joined by our incredibly talented QA team, who play at the highest level of competitive Aniville and play hours upon hours of the characters to make sure they're well balanced. Firstly, we have our QA lead, Butter King. Hello, Butter.
Hello.
We're also joined by our QA members, Lark. Hello, Lark.
Hello.
And Falchion. Hello, Falchion.
Hello there.
So to get this started, we're going to cover one of the most basic things you need to do if you want to do well in competitive play, which is memorizing the villain and fate decks of villains. It's very important to know what is in both your and your opponent's villain and fate decks so that you know what to expect and do in certain situations. So, QA team, would one of you like to start us off on this topic?
Well, it's important to, if you want to be good at a villain, to know what cards you actually have and what you can be faced with. That's just know your character, right? If you want to be good at a character, you have to know what your tools are, and you have to know what you're using your tools on.
Very well said, Lark. Falk, Butter, either of you want to follow up on that?
There are many times in many games where you have a way to victory or a way to have a very strong play that you just miss because you straight up do not read the card, the board state, or ignore something because you are tunnel visioning in on what you were thinking before. It's important to know the variety of tools you have and to not forget what some of them do, because it can lead to you completely forgetting what's happening and ignoring better options for worse ones just because that's what you were thinking before, or it's what you know.
Right. It's very important also to keep in mind the copies of cards in your deck, such as how many you have of certain effects or items and whatnot, to know how many cards you have to go through to get to those, and to try and figure out what game plan you need to take based on what you've drawn thus far, what you know you can draw, what you have to deal with from what's been played on you, and so on. And that's infinitely harder to do if you don't have a good knowledge and memorization of the decks you're playing. Memorizing those numbers and memorizing the cards themselves to know what you can expect to run into as you start to go through your deck and your opponent starts to go through your fate deck can make a huge difference, because it will inform you how you're going to be taking your next couple of turns, and thinking those few turns ahead is going to be the difference between a good player and a great player when it comes to 1v1 Anime Villainous.
In fact, we're actually going to see a lot of the points we're going to be talking about later. It's going to be really helpful for all of those points to remember what tools you have left to be able to mess with them.
Butter is very correct. This first tangent of memorizing cards and decks may seem like the most well-duh sort of advice, but it really sets what is basically the framework of becoming a better player. So after you get a good memorization of the villain's decks, the next thing that we're going to talk about is your action economy and managing your territory as a result of that action economy. Butter, give us a rundown.
First, let's quickly explain the term of what action economy is. The general idea is if I am performing more actions than my opponent, I am going to be able to win the game. So I want to be doing things that will give me more actions to be able to do.
And what's important about action economy in a game like Anime Villainous is both the access to and limiting of. The Fate deck is one of the most crucial aspects of the game because it is how you limit your opponent's action economy, both in the actions they are playing through their cards and their abilities from those cards, and just straight up being able to perform actions on their territory. The more you limit them and the less they limit you, the greater lead you're going to have on them as the game progresses.
And managing your territory, you're going to be doing that, by moving or defeating heroes, usually defeating heroes. This is often a playstyle thing, of like how determined you are to have a clear territory, and that depends on like which character you play. Like some are more fine with like letting heroes sit, but for some villains it is definitely very important to make sure that you are clearing your actions, because some people when they start getting covered and you don't fix it, it just gets harder and harder to undo that.
Well said. Going hand in hand with action economy is something we call fate pressure. As we've just explained, what really messes with your action economy is the fate deck, heroes coming out and covering some of your actions among other issues they can cause. Butter, if you wouldn't mind, tell us what fate pressure is exactly, and then we'll go over why it's so important and how it works.
Fate pressure is specifically talking about both how much you can fate your opponent and how much you are forcing them to fate you.
Yeah, fate pressure is the part of the game where you're going to want to murder your opponent. This is the part where people are actively going against each other and messing with each other's plans. You want to try and keep up some amount of consistency when it comes to fating, though that's not always possible, because you want to be consistently causing problems and not allowing your opponent to get into a rhythm, as they will be able to mess with you and you will not mess with them. Having the upper hand when it comes to a constant stream of fates while still making progress is important.
It's important to note that you don't have to fate every turn per se, or like every other turn. It's possible that you can just have such a very good scenario that you can just get away with doing a big push for progress, especially if your opponent's slowed down, to frighten them into having to take subpar turns just fading you to stop you from like advancing super far ahead.
If you know your opponent has like a weaker fate deck, you might just try to race them for a bit, not applying a lot of fate pressure, just trying to win.
That's a very good point. I think it's important to really get across that to be good at competitive Annabelle, you have to be able to recognize and know when you should push your own objective as opposed to just slowing down your opponent. Sometimes the best way to win a game, especially in the 1v1 environment, is to just focus on actually winning instead of just slowing down your opponent. Conversely, sometimes you need to realize when your opponent will likely win faster, and that's when you really need to try and apply more of that fate pressure to slow them down so that they can't be the one to outspeed you. Figuring out when to do that objective push on your end and when to slow yourself down a bit to apply more pressure to your opponent is a very important part of getting to a higher level of competitive play. Now, on to our next competitive topic. This is a very important one that goes hand in hand with deck memorization and kind of lines up with pushing your objective also. We're going to talk about hand movement, or more specifically, using the discard cards action. Butter, could you explain what exactly we mean by hand movement?
Hand movement is the idea of cards entering and leaving your hand. The more cards that leave your hand, the more cards from your deck that you will see. This goes hand in hand with cycling, which is the idea of playing cards and discarding cards just to get them out of your hand.
It's very important to be okay with discarding cards because you need to get to your important tools, and if you're not discarding cards, you can end up only drawing one card a turn, which is very, very slow in the long run, and you end up relying too much on luck. Don't get too attached to solutions in your hand to problems that don't exist. Focus on getting the solution to problems that do exist.
There's a good chance that if you discard that solution to the later problem, you're just going to draw that solution when the problem arises later.
Basically, if you get too held up on holding on to cards for potential problems, you're going to create a different problem for yourself, which is not drawing the other cards you need to actually win the game. There are times where it's good to hold on to a card if you know you'll absolutely need to have it, but in most scenarios, if you don't see yourself playing a card on your current turn or your next one, you probably need to discard it so you can dig through your deck faster. And I think we've gotten all the main points we wanted to cover with that. Butter, Lark, Falk, are there any final pieces of advice you'd like to add before we close up this video?
Let's say, observe how other players play a character that you want to be good at. And if you're having trouble playing against the character, try playing as that character yourself and see what the problems are that come from trying to play that character.
Yeah, if you can figure out how to play a different character, you can do a lot better job at figuring out what is their weak points and where to target.
If we're talking about very high level play, it's just as important to know what your opponent's working with than to know what you're working with. Knowing, okay, my opponent only has so many copies of so and so card that can get them out of this situation may mean that a fate card that may look worse in 90% of situations is actually the correct answer in this specific one, because they're not going to have the usual answer to it because they've already used it or discarded it.
Yeah, so if you're looking to get better against a specific villain or matchup, try playing as that villain that you're wanting to do better against. The better you get with the villain, the easier it will be for you to counter that villain, because you know what really makes them struggle or not. The last thing that I want to say, which is going to again sound like very obvious, well, of course, kind of advice, is just play the game a lot. You can gain a lot of skill in Anime Villainous just by playing enough to recognize board states and certain situations. For me personally, I got good at this game largely by watching other good players, such as our QA team here, and then practicing against them, other players in the Annaville Discord, and even practicing some solo games against myself. And with that, I believe we've reached the end of this starter's guide to competitive Annaville. Big thanks to our QA team for taking the time to make this video with me. I really appreciate you guys. And for those of you watching, there are links in the description to the Anime Villainous Discord server if you want to find people to play with or tournaments to partake in, so definitely check that out. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope to see you in future Anime Villainous videos. Until then,
See ya.
Sayonara.
See you later.
farewell.